connected to iPhone.
Okay, too much wind machine. Blow me away, by God.
The disaster artist.
There's a great big elephant in the room called the economy. So let's start talking about that. I wanted to give you a current picture of the economy. That's what I have behind myself. But of course, what we have to remember is this. And what we have to think about is when you're dancing in the flames, what's next? So what I'm going to try and do in the next 17 and a half minutes is I'm going to talk first about the flames, where we are in the economy, and then I'm going to take 3 trends that have taken place at TED over the last 25 years and that will take place in this conference, and I will try and bring them together. And I will try and give you a sense of what the ultimate reboot looks like. Those 3 trends are the ability to engineer cells, the ability to engineer tissues, and robots. And somehow it'll all make sense. But anyway, let's start with the economy. There's a couple of really big problems that are still sitting there. One is leverage. And the problem with leverage is it makes the U.S. financial system look like this. So a normal commercial bank has 9 to 10 times leverage. That means for every dollar you deposit, it loans out about 9 or 10. A normal investment bank is not a deposit bank, it's an investment bank. It has 15 to 20 times. It turns out that B of A in September had 32 times, and your friendly Citibank had 47 times. Oops. That means every bad loan goes bad 47 times over. And that, of course, is the reason why all of you are making such generous and wonderful donations to these nice folks. And as you think about that, you got to wonder, so what do banks have in store for you now? It ain't pretty. Well, the government, meanwhile, has been acting like Santa Claus. We all love Santa Claus, right? But the problem with Santa Claus is when you look at the mandatory spending of what these folks have been doing and promising folks, it turned out that in 1967, about 38% was mandatory spending on what we call entitlements. And then by 2007, it was 68%. And we weren't supposed to run into 100% until about 2030. Except we've been so busy giving away $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, that we've brought that date of reckoning forward to about 2017. And we thought we were going to be able to lay these debts off on our kids, but guess what? We were going to start to pay. And the problem with this stuff is now that the bills come due, it turns out Santa isn't quite as cute when it's summertime, right? Here's some advice from one of the largest investors in the United States. This guy runs the China Investment Corporation. He is the main buyer of U.S. Treasury bonds, and he gave an interview in December. Here's his first bit of advice, and here's his second bit of advice. And by the way, the Chinese Prime Minister reiterated this at Davos last Sunday. this stuff is getting serious enough that if we don't start paying attention to the deficit, we're going to end up losing the dollar. And then all bets are off. Let me show you what it looks like. I think I can safely say that I'm the only trillionaire in this room. This is an actual bill, and it's $10 trillion. And the only problem with this bill is it's not really worth very much. That was $8 last week, $4 this week, $1 next week. And that's what happens to currencies when you don't stand behind them. So the next time that somebody as cute as this shows up on your doorstep, and sometimes this creature is called Chrysler, and sometimes Ford, and sometimes whatever you want, you've just got to say no. And you've got to start banishing a word that's called entitlement. And the reason we have to do that in the short term is because we have just run out of cash. If you look at the federal budget, this is what it looks like. The orange slice is what's discretionary. Everything else is mandated. It makes no difference if we cut out the bridges to Alaska in the overall scheme of things. So what we have to start thinking about doing is capping our medical spending, because that's a monster that's simply going to eat the entire budget. We've got to start thinking about asking people to retire a little bit later. If you're 60 to 65, you retire on time. Your 401k just got nailed. If you're 50 to 60, we want you to work 2 years more. If you're under 50, we want you to work 4 more years. And the reason why that's reasonable is when your grandparents were given Social Security, they got it at 65 and they're expected to check out at 68. 68 is young today. We've also got to cut the military about 3% a year. We've got to limit other mandatory spending. We've got to quit borrowing as much, because otherwise that interest is going to eat that whole pie. And we've got to end up with a smaller government. And if we don't start changing this trend line, we are going to lose the dollar and start to look like Iceland. Now, I got what you're thinking. This is going to happen when hell freezes over. But let me remind you, this December it did snow in Vegas. Here's what happens if you don't address this stuff. So Japan had a fiscal and real estate crisis back in the late 80s. And its 225 largest companies today are worth 1/4 of what they were 18 years ago. We don't fix this now, how would you like to see a Dow 3500 in 2026? Because that's the consequence of not dealing with this stuff. And unless if you want this person to become the CFO, not just of Florida, but the United States, we better deal with this stuff. That's the short term, that's the flame part. That's the financial crisis. Now, right behind the financial crisis, there's a second and bigger wave that we need to talk about. That wave is much larger, much more powerful, and that's, of course, the wave of technology. And what's really important in this stuff is, as we cut, we also have to grow. Among other things, because venture-backed startup companies are 0.02% of US GDP investment, and they're about 17.8% of output. It's groups like that in this room that generate the future of the US economy, and that's what we've got to be growing. We don't have to keep growing these bridges to nowhere. So let's bring a romance novelist into this conversation. And that's where these 3 trends come together. That's where the ability to engineer microbes, the ability to engineer tissues, and the ability to engineer robots begin to lead to a reboot. And let me recap some of the stuff you've seen. Craig Venter showed up here last year and showed you the first fully programmable cell.
Well, you just put me up on something, bro. I ain't know the beta for that was out. Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. I seen a clip with Norman Reedus and fucking Hideo Kojima, and then I seen a preview for this shit called Battle Angel, yo. This live action movie based on this old ass anime. Video games and anime. So nigga love. Video games and anime. Ghost Recon Wildlands was the last game I bought though. I keep thinking about getting that Assassin's Creed Origins, but I just haven't. I don't know. Just ain't got that shit, you know. Seems like lately, the more I play video games, the more I feel guilty about that shit. I'm like, damn, Trap, you could be doing, you could be painting or doing some other shit. It's like, oh well. What's good in the hood though? Video games and anime.
That acts like hardware, where you can insert DNA and have it boot up as a different species. In parallel, the folks at MIT have been building a standard registry of biological parts. So think of it as a Radio Shack for biology. You can go out and get your proteins or your RNA or your DNA or whatever and start building stuff. In 2006, they brought together high school students and college students and started to build these little odd creatures. They just happened to be alive instead of circuit boards. Here's one of the first things they built. So cells have this cycle. First they don't grow, then they grow exponentially, and then they stop growing. Graduate students wanted to find a way of telling which stage they were in. So they engineered these cells so that when they're growing in the exponential phase, they would smell like wintergreen. And when they stopped growing, they would smell like bananas. And you could tell very easily when your experiment was working and wasn't, where it was in the phase. This got a little bit more complicated 2 years later. 21 countries came together, dozens of teams, they started competing. The team from Rice University started to engineer the substance in red wine that makes red wine good for you into beer. So you take resveratrol and put it into beer. Of course, one of the judges is wandering by and he goes, "Wow, cancer-fighting beer. There is a God." The team from Taiwan was a little bit more ambitious. They tried to engineer bacteria in such a way that they would act as your kidneys. 4 years ago, I showed you this picture. And people oohed and awed because Cliff Tabin had been able to grow an extra wing on a chicken. And that was very cool stuff back then. But now moving from bacterial engineering to tissue engineering, let me show you what's happened in that period of time. 2 years ago, you saw this creature, an almost extinct animal from Xochimilco, Mexico, called an ajolote, that can regenerate its limbs. You can freeze half the heart, it regrows. You can freeze half the brain, it regrows. It's almost like leaving Congress. But now you don't have to have the animal itself to regenerate, because you can build clone mice molars in petri dishes. And of course, if you can build mice molars in petri dishes, you can grow human molars in petri dishes. This should not surprise you, right? I mean, you're born with no teeth. You give away all your teeth to the tooth fairy. You regrow a set of teeth. But then if you lose one of those second set of teeth, they don't regrow unless you're a lawyer. But of course, for most of us, we know how to grow teeth, and therefore we can take adult stem teeth, put them on a biodegradable mold, regrow a tooth, and simply implant it. And we can do it with other things. So a Spanish woman who was dying of TB had a donor trachea. They took all the cells off the trachea, they spray painted her stem cells onto that cartilage. She regrew her own trachea, and 72 hours later it was implanted. She's now running around with her kids. This is going on in Tony Atala's lab in Wake Forest, where he's regrowing ears for injured soldiers, and he's also regrowing bladders. So there are now 9 women walking around Boston with regrown bladders, which is much more pleasant than walking around with a whole bunch of plastic bags the rest of your life. This is kind of getting boring, right? I mean, you understand where this story is going. But it gets more interesting. Last year, this group was able to take all the cells off a heart, leaving just the cartilage. Then they sprayed stem cells onto that heart from a mouse. Those stem cells self-organized, and that heart started to beat. Life happens. This may be one of the ultimate papers. This was done in Japan and in the US, published at the same time, and it rebooted skin cells into stem cells last year. That means that you can take the stuff right here and turn it into almost anything in your body. And this is becoming common. It's moving very quickly. It's moving in a whole series of places. Third trend, robots. Those of us of a certain age grew up expecting that by now we would have Rosie the robot from the Jetsons in our house. And all we've got is a Roomba. We also thought we'd have this robot to warn us of danger. Didn't happen. These were robots engineered for a flat world, right? So Rosie ran on skates, and the other one ran on flat threads. If you don't have a flat world, that's not good. Which is why the robots we're designing today are a little different. This is Boston Dynamics Big Dog. And this is about as close as you can get to a physical Turing test. Okay, so let me remind you, a Turing test is where you've got a wall, you're talking to somebody on the other side of the wall, and when you don't know if that thing is human or animal, that's when computers have reached human intelligence. This is not an intelligence Turing test, but this is as close as you can get to a physical Turing test. And this stuff is moving very quickly, and by the way, that thing can carry about 350 pounds of weight. These are not the only interesting robots. You've also got flies, the size of flies, that are being made by Robert Wood at Harvard. You've got sticky bots that are being made at Stanford. And as you bring these things together, as you bring cells, biological tissue engineering, and mechanics together, you begin to get some really odd questions. In the last Olympics, this gentleman, who had several world records in the Special Olympics, tried to run in the normal Olympics. The only issue with Oscar Pistorius is he was born without bones in the lower part of his legs. He came within about a second of qualifying. He sued to be allowed to run, and he won the suit, but didn't qualify by time. Next Olympics, you can bet that Oscar or one of Oscar's successors is going to make the time. And 2 or 3 Olympics after that, they are going to be unbeatable. And as you bring these trends together, and as you think of what it means to take people who are profoundly deaf, who can now begin to hear, I mean, remember the evolution of hearing aids, right? I mean, your grandparents had these great big cones, and then your parents had these odd boxes that would squawk at odd times during dinner. And now we have these little buds that nobody sees. And now you have cochlear implants that go into people's heads and allow the deaf to begin to hear. Now, they can't hear as well as you and I can, but in 10 or 15 machine generations, they will. And these are machine generations, not human generations. And about 2 or 3 years after they can hear as well as you and I can, then they'll be able to hear maybe how bats sing, or how whales talk, or how dogs talk, and other types of tonal scales. They'll be able to focus their hearing, they'll be able to increase the sensitivity, decrease the sensitivity, do a series of things that we can't do, and the same thing is happening in eyes. This is a group in Germany that's beginning to engineer eyes so that people who are blind can begin to see light and dark. Very primitive. And then they'll be able to see shape. And then they'll be able to see color, and then they'll be able to see in definition. And one day they'll see as well as you and I can. And a couple of years after that, they'll be able to see an ultraviolet, they'll be able to see an infrared, they'll be able to focus their eyes, they'll be able to come into a micro focus. They'll do stuff you and I can't do. All of these things are coming together, and it's a particularly important thing to understand as we worry about the flames of the present, to keep an eye on the future. And of course, the future is looking back 200 years, because next week is the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And it's the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of the Species. And Darwin, of course, argued that evolution is a natural state. It is a natural state in everything that is alive, including hominids. There have actually been 22 species of hominids that have been around, have evolved, have wandered in different places, and have gone extinct. It is common for hominids to evolve. And that's the reason why, as you look at the hominid fossil record, Erectus, and Heidelbergensis, and Florensis, and Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens all overlapped. The common stage of affairs is to have overlapping versions of hominids, not one. And as you think of the implications of that, here's a brief history of the universe. The universe was created 13.7 billion years ago, and then you created all the stars and all the planets and all the galaxies and all the Milky Ways, and then you created Earth about 4.5 billion years ago, and then you got life about 4 billion years ago, and then you got hominids about 0.006 billion years ago, and then you got our version of hominids about 0.0015 billion years ago. Ta-da! Maybe the reason for the creation of the universe, and all the galaxies and all the planets and all the energy and all the dark energy and the rest of the stuff, is to create what's in this room. Maybe not. That would be a mildly arrogant viewpoint. So if that's not the purpose of the universe, then what's next? And I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a different species of a hominid. I think we're going to move from a Homo sapiens into a Homo evolutus. And I think this isn't 1,000 years out. I think most of us are going to glance at it, and our grandchildren are going to begin to live it. And a Homo evolutus brings together these three trends into a hominid that takes direct and deliberate control over the evolution of his species, her species, and other species. And that, of course, would be the ultimate reboot. Thank you very much.
These motherfuckers already know, man. They about to make a different species, yo. They about to.
Good morning, everybody. So just to remind everybody that there's also plenty of room for seating in Hall C. So
pause, bitch. They about to really push this shit, yo. All these life extendancy programs, they gonna have motherfuckers that can live for 100 years. I mean, like 300 years without fucking aging. Matter of fact, I heard some lecture talk about the death of death. Like one day they gonna just figure out how not to fucking die at all. But that shit sounds crazy.
If you're struggling to find a seat, there's plenty of room there. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce Brendan Fry. Brendan is a professor at the University of Toronto with appointments in both engineering and medicine. He's made fundamental contributions in both machine learning and genomics. So during his PhD with Geoff Hinton, he co-invented the wake-sleep algorithm, which is a precursor to the variational autoencoders and GANs that we know and love today. He's also made seminal contributions to message passing and factor graphs, and he's also the inventor of affinity propagation, which is a clustering algorithm widely used in the sciences for data analysis. For the last 10 years or so, Brendan has turned his attention to biology and has pioneered the use of deep learning to understand the genome. He has had a series of high-impact papers in Science and Nature, and recently he founded the company Deep Genomics with the goal of turning these breakthroughs into practical healthcare solutions. So please welcome Brendan.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And right off the bat, I'd like to say thank you to all my colleagues and collaborators and my team at Deep Genomics, which has made all of this work that I'll be talking about today possible. So what I'm going to talk about is the future of medicine. And what I believe is that AI is going to completely change medicine. And also, without artificial intelligence, medicine is going to completely fail. And I'll present some results to show you kind of what's going on and why I believe this is the case. So first of all, I'm going to show a picture of myself because people at the back probably can't see me. All right, so for those of you at the back, that's what I look like. And now I'm going to tell you a personal story. About 15 years ago, my wife at the time and I found out that she was pregnant, and we found out the baby she was carrying had a genetic problem. We went to see a genetic counselor, and the genetic counselor said essentially it could be nothing, don't worry, or it could be a disaster. And as you can imagine, it was a very difficult time for us. Emotionally and also in terms of trying to make decisions. And what I took out of that experience was really two things. First of all, this wonderful appreciation for machine learning and deep learning I had learned by working with Geoff Hinton. I should put those skills to use to solve a bigger problem than detecting cats in YouTube videos. And obviously the problem in front of me was medicine. The second thing I learned is the potential for machine learning and deep learning to really make a difference.
Oh man,
the human genome had just been sequenced at a cost of about $1 billion, but that cost has come down. And so here was this data file that you could download and look at. And people really didn't understand what it meant or how it worked, but I thought that was a good idea for a research problem to apply machine learning to. So I'm going to tell you another story. This is a personal story about a little girl called Nora. Her name's Nora, and she has a disease called spinal muscular atrophy. She's 3 years old. She's very fortunate to be alive. Most children with spinal muscular atrophy die within the first year or two of life. It's the leading cause of infant mortality in North America. What's interesting about this disease is it has a very simple genetic basis. It's also interesting that it took so long to try to figure out a cure. And I'm going to talk about that later on. It's a really nice end to that story. So some statistics. 65% of the people in this room, or if you think about your loved ones and friends, 65% of you in your lifetime will have a disease with a genetic basis. So it doesn't mean it's just a simple genetic disease. It could be complex like diabetes, but there's a genetic basis to that disease. 65%. If we look at babies, 8 million births per year will have the baby will have a serious genetic defect. Serious one. And if we just look at the US healthcare system, the lifetime cost of such a baby on average is $5 million per baby. So these are some of the numbers. Setting aside the obvious emotional component to this, these are some of the numbers that give you a sense of the weight of what's going on here. Let's compare this to other markets. If we look at just the US and Europe, the healthcare budget last year was $7 trillion. Comparing that to the global IT market, that's $3.7 trillion. And if you combine Apple, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, their revenue last year was $0.53 trillion. So it puts these costs in perspective when comparing them with some of these other companies. I mentioned pharmaceuticals before, so this is a very important story. These are recent results, and on the x-axis here you're seeing years, so 1990 to 2020. On the y-axis you're seeing the internal rate of return. The way to interpret that number is if you're going to invest money in a pharmaceutical company, so we're looking at pharmaceutical companies here, versus put your money in the bank and think about getting interest, you can compare the internal rate of return to how much you get if you just put money in the bank. And you can see how the plot looks. It's pretty devastating, going from a high value, around 30% in 1990, and around 2012 it actually dropped below the bank rate. So retrospectively, it looks like in 2012, you would have been better off to put your money into a bank into the bank than put it into a pharmaceutical company. And in 2020, it's expected to drop to zero. It's better to stuff your money on your mattress than put it into a pharmaceutical company. All right, so what's the problem? And this is the problem I confronted in 2002 when I decided to switch into this area of genomics and genome biology. It was nicely captured by Eric Lander, who's a senior, well-respected researcher in the area of genome biology, who quipped in 2004, Genome bought the book hard to read. So sure, you can sequence the 3 billion letters, 3 billion from your mother, 3 billion from your father, you get the text, but what does it mean? What do we do with that text? And that's the main problem confronting genome biology and confronting medicine today. I would argue that's why that curve is dropping to zero. All right, so here's what I've been working on for the last 15 years, and a whole bunch of other researchers, many of which are in the audience here today, have been working on as well. Is figuring out how to convert the genome to actionable information. So first of all, just a little bit of information about how the genome works. Just a very quick 1-minute tutorial on the genome. 3 billion letters from your mom, 3 billion letters from your dad, a sequence of A, C, G, and T. Essentially, each gene consists of a promoter region, which basically activates the gene. There's patterns in that promoter region, signals or words, if you like, that lead that gene to be activated or expressed. And then following that promoter region, there's alternating exons and introns.
It's an easel. You want the specific name for it? The exact name for this easel? There's one here that looks really similar. It's called the Carolina Studio H frame, which is basically what I'm using right now. The H frame easel. Let's see. No. So this is the one I have right here. This is called the Double Mass Studio H frame. Wow, they're really cheap too. It's not as cheap as what I paid for mine, but that's because I got mine in store. Damn, I should have just ordered one of these offline. Damn, Dick Blick be trying to get motherfuckers at their prices, yo. Yo, this easel at Dick Blick was priced at $700 something, and they had it on sale for like $160. But right here, this one is the exact same kind as I have, and it's only $249. So where did Dick Blick get the other $500 from to price their easel? That's crazy. Anyway, it's an H frame. Yeah. All right. Ooh, dang! I only been here less than an hour, and I'm already hungry as hell, yo.
What good is a part if your field tech can't get it in time? With thousands of pickup locations, UPS gets them what they need fast. Less time waiting.
And introns. So the exons here are shown in orange, the introns are shown in light gray. So these patterns alternate. The introns are quite long, 1,000 or 10,000 nucleotides long. The exons are relatively short, around 100 nucleotides long. You could think of the exons as the print statements, if you want to think of this as software. The exons are the print statements. The exons are the parts that end up in the protein. The introns get cut out, they get removed. However, the introns contain crucial control logic. So there are words embedded in the introns that direct the cells, tell the cells how to cut and paste these pieces so as to put these exons together and make the gene. A little bit more biology. This is a picture that depicts the central dogma of genome biology. We go from DNA, which is a sequence of these A, C, Gs, and Ts. The gene is transcribed into RNA, and then the RNA is processed in various ways. For example, those introns are cut out. That's a step of processing that occurs on the RNA. And then the RNA is translated into protein. Now the picture is much more complicated than this. As you might guess, biology is complicated and multi-layered. And so proteins go back and interact with DNA. In fact, protein is what causes gene expression to occur. A protein binds to the promoter of the DNA, of the gene. Proteins also interact with RNA. RNA interacts with RNA. RNA interacts with protein. So you have all of these arrows going back and forth relating these different entities. So biology is complex. And I think something that we need to appreciate going forward is that really biology is too complex for any one researcher or any group of researchers to understand. So that has implications for how we're going to go forward. And another way to view this is that really in the last few years, our ability to measure our biology, whether it's with a Fitbit or different technologies that allow you to measure metabolites or your genome, different sorts of things going on inside of your body, our ability to measure our biology and our ability to alter our biology using things like DNA editing has far surpassed our ability to understand our biology. So humans are kind of out of the loop going forward. All right, so let's think about how we, this community here, and the many researchers already working in this area, can have an impact. So first of all, I want to talk about data sets, right? Machine learning researchers, AI researchers, they like data sets. So here are a few examples of different kinds of data in this community. So on the x-axis here was plotted the average gigabytes per data set, so how big the data set is. On the y-axis, the number of data sets that you can download from the internet of that size. So targeted RNA, that's that intermediate molecule, DNA, RNA, protein. Targeted RNA, there's been a technology around for 30 years that allows you to read out the sequence of that RNA molecule. And so people have looked at very narrowly focused examples, a particular gene, or they look at a few genes. That's called a gene panel. And you can see here that those data sets are small. There's a very large number of such data sets. Just under 1 million data sets of that size. In the far upper right, those are the genome sequencing data sets, so DNA. So that's where the entire sequence of 3 billion letters is produced. That's the data file you download. And there's over 1 million of those data sets. You can also see RNA data sets. Those are data sets where researchers take samples out of your cells and then look at all of the RNA molecules in your cells. So these are big data sets. You can download them. Another interesting one is over there in the lower right, 3D DNA. I might have time to talk about that later. So what I'm going to do next is tell you a little bit about a few examples of things that people have worked on in the community, and a couple examples from my group and Deep Genomics. One of the examples goes back to 2010.
Yeah, what's up, guys?
This is where we used machine learning to understand how words embedded in introns control those print statements, splicing, which puts exons into the proteins. And we were able to use machine learning to reverse engineer, if you like, infer those code words and how that works, that regulatory code, using data sets. Another recent example, and this is work by Jeff Bilmes and Bill Noble, is, oh no, this is not the slide. This is Nir Friedman and Aviv Rejev's work. This is something really neat called a giga parallel reporter assay. So about 5 years ago, there was something called a mega or a massively parallel reporting assay, which allowed us to synthesize 100,000 genes. This was in yeast. But now, just recently, this paper was published where over 100 million synthetic yeast genes were produced. And so instead of trying to understand the natural system, which is what we did in that Nature paper, what they're doing here is just generating artificial genes, a huge number of artificial genes, and then trying to, again, figure out how the biology works. Another example is, if you think back to that diagram I showed you where proteins can interact with RNA and proteins can interact with DNA, there are data sets that allow you to measure interactions between proteins and DNA and understand how that works. So this is some work that my group recently did where we took a data set from Ray et al., which is 240,000 designed sequences. Okay, so this is RNA or DNA sequences that are artificially designed. And then for a given protein, you can see where the protein sticks. Which of those sequences does that protein like to bind to? And so this gives you a big data matrix of 240,000 design sequences by 200 proteins. And the machine learning task here is to learn how to take a sequence and from the sequence predict whether the protein will bind or not. So what do we do with that data? So this was work that we published in Nature Biotechnology in 2015. This is a convolutional net. The way it works is we take the mini batches, which contain these sequences that were designed, so those are fed in. A convolutional network just sweeps patterns or filters across those different sequences. And so for each of the sequences, we get some intermediate representation, just as in a standard convolutional network that you would use for computer vision. That intermediate representation is then fed into different layers of convolution and pooling. Also, of course, fully connected layers, which produce the output. And then the output is compared to the measurement, the stuff I just showed you there in that big matrix. And then backpropagation is used to update the parameters. So why I'm showing you this is to show you that really it's a fairly simple machine learning problem. Given the data sets, given properly processed data sets and organized data sets, you can have a big impact in this field. One of the challenges is figuring out the right metric, and so here we're comparing the measured binding affinity, how much that protein actually sticks to the sequence, to the output of the neural network, and what is the right cost function for producing a neural network that is useful in practice. And that's one of the things that my colleagues here explored, is different kinds of cost functions. So what would we do with this neural net, right? If you downloaded one of these data sets and trained a neural network, what would you do with it? So here's an example that shows you how you can use that model that I just showed you to identify pathological mutations and even figure out how to possibly fix them. So down on the lower left, what you're seeing is a sequence from the cholesterol gene, LDLR. This is from the promoter of that gene. And the sequence was fed into that model I just showed you, that it was trained to predict binding affinity of proteins. So the sequence was fed into that model, and then the output of the neural network, which tells you its prediction for how strongly the protein will bind to the sequence, is shown using the heights of these letters. Okay, so you see the letters A, T, C, G, and the height of the letter corresponds to the output of the neural network. So then what we did is we artificially, in silico, looked at every possible mutation
This is
in the
a short
promoter.
ass. I don't know
So for
why.
each nucleotide, say the nucleotide had a value
I am
A,
fucking
we
starting,
would switch it to G, C, and T, and for each of
I
those
was like, oh, I'll
possibilities,
go in there and
we'd
stream
run
for
the
a couple
entire
hours and
promoter
then come
through our
down
neural
and
network
eat, and
and
all
get
of a
the
sudden,
output of the
like,
neural
yo, it's
network.
starting to hit me like,
So now we can see for each of those
I'm
possible
fucking hungry as
mutations
shit.
how much the mutation changes the output. That is, how
Fuck,
much
go
our
get
neural
my
network
food.
predicts that mutation will disrupt protein binding. And it turns out protein binding, correctly or incorrectly, is crucial for health. So that's what the white box down below shows you. All right, so for each of the letters A, C, G, and T, there's a color code where pink or bright red indicates a positive mutation. So that's a mutation that will cause the protein to bind more strongly. And the blue indicates a negative mutation where the protein will bind more weakly. All right. And the rows are, you can see the key on the far left, the rows are organized as A, C, G, or T. So if the sequence has a G in it, and then you look at the row corresponding to G, it's just white, that's because you haven't made a mutation. You've changed a G to a G, so there's no change in the output of the neural network. On the other hand, if you look at an example where the original promoter has a T, and look at that column, you'll see switching it from T to different letters has a big impact. There we go. So if we look at this example here, this letter T, this is in the naturally occurring promoter, there's a T at this location. If it's mutated to a C, there's a large drop in the binding affinity of that protein. If it's mutated to a G, there's a strong increase in the binding affinity of that protein. So, now what do we do with this map? We can compare it to known results, and these are mutations that are in a database of carefully curated mutations corresponding to diseases involving cholesterol levels. And you can see, first of all, there's good agreement. If you compare the yellow dots, which is the known disease mutations, to our map, mutation map, if you like, of these mutations, there's good agreement. And then you also see that in some cases our model makes predictions that have not been seen before in the clinic. And so if we look, for example, in this column here where the naturally occurring letter is a C, our model predicts if it's mutated to an A, we'll see a big drop in the level of protein binding. Another example, this is the example from Films and Noble. And this one is for figuring out the 3D structure, or the chromatin interaction structure, I should say, of DNA. So DNA is wrapped up into chromatin, and what's important for transcription, this process of gene expression, is the structure of this chromatin. For example, the chromatin can touch itself, and that can help enhance gene expression. And so the data, which is shown at the bottom here, can be viewed as a sort of a matrix form. So if you look over here, different locations here are different nucleotides in the DNA sequence, wrapped up in the chromatin. And then what this map tells you is if you compare two locations, how strongly they like to interact. So if two parts of the DNA are brought together like that, you get the bright dot to indicate this contact. Okay, so that's how the data is expressed. And this was experimentally measured. And then what these researchers did is they trained a multi-layer convolutional network to take as input the raw DNA sequence and also a signal called chromatin accessibility, which just basically tells you how available the DNA is. And so is it unwrapped, or does it tend to be bundled up into the chromatin and not available? So they took those two tracks. One's just the raw sequence of DNA.
Alright, I'm about to go eat, but it's still kind of early, so there's a chance I can be back in here on the late tip, like 10:30 or 11 or something, for another hour or so. But then I'll be up early again in the morning. I'm gonna hit the gym, and as soon as I get out the gym, I gotta go print out some photographs for some upcoming projects that I'm working on, and then I'll be right in here streaming live. Alright guys, appreciate everybody stopping in for a little while and checking me out. Like I said, I'm fucking hungry, guys. I'm about to go eat real quick. Peace till next time.